G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Isaiah. This has been taken from a commentary that has been produced by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the founder of RL Ministries. Thank you for coming along. Well, welcome along. We're into session 26, book of Isaiah. We're going to look at chapter 49 this evening from verse 1 down to verse 26. Just a quick recap on last session. We saw that God is the God in control. We saw that he's the God of eternity, first and last, from beginning to end, God of creation. He's the God who laid the foundations of the earth. He's the one who spread out the universe. He's the one who created all the parts of the universe, in fact, and they're all his servants. He's the God of human affairs because we saw that he declared the coming of Cyrus and his victories. He's also the God of prophecy because he never hid anything. From the time they were, he existed. And that's the prophecies. He existed to proclaim the coming and of things to come. In fact, we have today the prophecy, which are still things to come. He's also the God of the Trinity. Remember, we saw a particular verse last session, Isaiah 48:16. In Isaiah 48:16, it's the clearest Old Testament passage that shows the triunity of God. Jehovah is Israel's Redeemer. He's the Holy One of Israel. Jehovah is the one who teaches Israel. However, we saw Israel's disobedience, and so they're paying for it. And the result of that was that there's no peace, there was no righteousness for Israel, there's no increase in the Jewish population, because as we said, they should have millions and millions of people by today, but they haven't. Israel was brought into captivity by the Babylonians, again for her disobedience, and there was, after the fulfillment of prophecy of Cyrus, there was a call then for the Jew to leave Babylon in light of being emancipated by Cyrus and the defeat of Babylon. And God says that they're to leave with rejoicing because they're going back into the land and God has redeemed them from Babylon. On the way back from Babylon, they lacked nothing. We saw miracles. Well, we know that miracles happened because Isaiah tells us miracles happened, but nobody else records those miracles. We had water, for instance, in the desert. Now, because Israel disobeyed the earlier prophecies, that we saw that there was no peace for them. But now, for those Jews who do return to Israel, they're going to actually receive peace in their journey because they're going back in obedience to God, back into the land. Those who reject the call to go back, the obligation to fulfill prophecy to go back into the land and refuse to leave Babylon, they're going to be in a time when there is no peace for them. All right, so let's look into, we're looking in now into the section where we spoke about before. It's that her iniquity is pardoned. This goes from 49:1 down to 57, verse 21. Now, just a quick recap. From 40:12 to 48:22, Isaiah has dealt in detail with the first point that her warfare is accomplished. Her warfare is accomplished or ended through the 70-year Babylonian captivity. Israel has received enough warfare. Now Babylon will be taken over and the Jews will be permitted to return. In the next section, 49 to 57, Isaiah will not deal with near prophecies, but far prophecies. The second point is that her iniquity is now pardoned. He'll deal with the final salvation and restoration of Israel. Chapters 58 to 66 will end the section by explaining that Israel has received of Jehovah's hand double for all her sins. Key character of the first subdivision, remember, was Cyrus the Great, through whom Israel was restored from Babylon. He will not be mentioned again. The key character of the second subdivision now is the Jewish Messiah, through whom Israel's iniquity is going to be pardoned. Messianic person plays a leading role now, especially in chapters 49 and 50, and also in 52:13 to 53:12. The text no longer deals primarily with near prophecies, but with far prophecies. It covers the final salvation and restoration of Israel. As we're going to see, the key means by which the iniquity is going to be pardoned is going to be by the death of the suffering servant of Jehovah, and that will be the servant of Isaiah 53 when we get there. Okay, we're going to look at the mission of the servant of Jehovah, which is 49, verse 1 to 26, and it's what we're going to hopefully cover in this section. The servant's ministry we see in verses 1 to 13, but we see, before we get there, we're going to see the servant's discouragement in 49, 1 to 4. It begins here, verse 49 begins with a word of discouragement. And it's the servant who is speaking here, which is the second person of the triunity. He calls the islands and the entire world to pay attention. He says, listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, you peoples from far. Now, those two words, unto me, should take us back to 48:16, right, which is that Trinity chapter verse, where Isaiah says, come ye near unto me, hear ye this, from the beginning I have not spoken in secret, from the time that it was, there am I, and now the Lord Jehovah has sent me and his Spirit. So we noted that chapter 48:16 is the closest, clearest Trinitarian verse in the Old Testament. It is the closest place in the entire Old Testament that we see the three persons in the Godhead. And this verse now shows a transition from the main theme of Cyrus in chapter 48, verses 14 and 15, to the messianic person now in verse 16. And now the same person speaking in 48:16 is also speaking in chapter 49 as he calls the attention of the islands to listen to the call of the servant. And in the second part of verse 1 goes on to say that this servant was elected for the task that was given to him. The expression, Jehovah has called me from the womb, this expression means it's election for a specific purpose. Now, who else do we hear that about? Jeremiah 1:5, where Jeremiah was called in these same terms to the office of a prophet. So just as God separated Jeremiah from the womb to be Israel's prophet of condemnation and to announce the Babylonian judgment, in the same way, Messiah was elected for the specific tasks of bringing redemption to Israel. In verse 1c, third part of verse 1, the servant further explains. He says, from the bowels of my mother has he made mention of my name. Now, we already saw this was true right back in Isaiah 7:14, where we had the first prediction of the virgin birth of the Messianic King. Isaiah 7:14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Emmanuel. So Isaiah 49:1 is simply a reiteration of the fact of Isaiah 7 verse 14. And this verse presupposes Isaiah 7:14. The fulfillment of this Isaiah 7:14 and this particular passage here comes later on in Matthew, in the Gospels, in Matthew chapter 1:21 and Luke 1:31 with the birth of the Messiah. Now, throughout Messianic prophecies, we often have mention of the mother, as we have here, where he says, from the loins or from the bowels of my mother has he made mention of my name. Now, many Messianic prophecies mention the mother of the Messiah. However, there's not a single Messianic prophecy in the Old Testament that mentions the father of the Messiah. Well, why not? Well, because the Messiah had no human father. He was born of a virgin. So although the mother of the Messiah is quite often mentioned, that is not the case of the father. He has no human father. He's never mentioned because the Messiah would have no human father by virtue of the virgin birth of Isaiah 7:14. Now verse 2 gives the Messiah's position. And he has made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand has he hid me. And he has made me a polished shaft. In his quiver has he kept me close. First of all, we see here, his mouth is like a sharp sword. And this expression here means that the servant will have the ability to pronounce judgment. He'll be decisive and be able to get to the root of the problem and to pronounce judgment upon it. A good example of this is in Matthew 23, verses 1-39, where he pronounced the woe judgments upon the Pharisees. Now, the second thing concerning the Messiah's position, it says he's hidden in the shadow of God's hand. So what does this imply? Well, this implies protection. Not only will the Messiah be given the ability to be incisive and pronounce judgment at the root of the problem, but he'll also have a special protection of God the Father so that he would not be hurt outside the will of God. And third, he'll be like a polished shaft. and an arrow in God's quiver. So this implies that he'll always be available for immediate usage for anything that God's purpose might call him to do. He'll be ready and at attention. So these 3 points essentially summarize the servant's position in relationship to God the Father. Now, verse 3 is more significant. He said unto me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Now, why does he say Israel here when he refers to the Messiah? Why is he doing that? Well, how do we know that he's really dealing with the messianic person and not referring to Israel, the nation, as the rabbis claim? Because they claim this is referring to Israel, the nation. How do we know that when he uses the term Israel, that he's not dealing with the nation of Israel here, but with the messianic person? Israel as a nation is also God's servant in other passages. Now, because a servant is distinguished from Israel in this very same context, if we look down into verse 5 of this Isaiah 49, verse 5, and now says Jehovah that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him. Now go to verse 6. He says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserves of Israel. Obviously, if we look at verses 5 and 6, obviously the servant throughout this passage is not the nation of Israel, but the messianic person, because this person is going to be used to restore Israel. It's going to raise up the tribes of Jacob. Moreover, since he's distinguished from Israel in verses 5 and 6, then verse 3 is not dealing with the nation of Israel. It is dealing with the messianic person. It should also be noted here, and remember this, that the book of Isaiah uses many names and titles for Messiah, including, we just saw in Isaiah 7:14, Emmanuel. We see Wonderful Counselor. We see Mighty God. We see the Father of Eternity. We see the Prince of Peace. And we see the servant of Jehovah. So in this verse, yet another name is given to Messiah, and he's now called Israel. Since he's not dealing with the nation of Israel here, why then does he name the servant Israel? There are 2 ways to answer this question. Now, one way is that the servant is the Israelite par excellence. He is the ideal Israelite. He will accomplish as an individual Jew what all Israel failed. So in that sense, he is a true Israelite. He will fulfill the calling of Israel to be the Or HaGoyim, or the light to the Gentiles. And so in this sense, he is the true Israel. Now, another way of looking at it, and we look at it from 2 perspectives here, and I think they're probably both valid here. What does the name Israel mean? Well, it means a prince with God. Who is more of a prince with God than the messianic person himself? So what we can see here in verse 3 is that we're dealing with the ideal Israelite par excellence. He is a true representative of the meaning of the name Israel. And because the Messiah will be a prince with God, and God the Father will be glorified in this servant. Now, where do we have a reference to this very prophecy? In Christ's high priestly prayer of John 17, God the Father is glorified in the Son, and here are the Old Testament bases for that statement. Now, in verse 4, the servant makes his complaint. We have already seen the servant's calling. He is to be God's special instrument to be used by God in various facets to fulfill the very things that Israel failed to do. However, notice in verse 4 how he complains. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for naught and vanity. Now, the word vain means emptiness. It seems here that all he ever produced, this is the messianic servant, or that all he ever produced was emptiness. And the Hebrew word for naught is tohu, and it means formlessness. Now, this is the same word that is used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, to describe the formlessness of the earth. So he goes on to say here, I have spent my strength for naught and vanity. The word vanity in this verse is hevel, which means vapor and breath. What he's saying is that his work seemed like a vapor which just disappeared into the thin air. There was nothing left. Now, this complaint, it may have been part of Messiah's agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, which we see in Matthew 26:42, and Luke 22:43 to 44. Because remember, at that point, when he's in the garden in prayer, at that point, only a handful of men were with him, and nothing seemed to be left of his ministry. It seemed as if the whole nation had rejected him, and that is actually what they did. Nationally, they rejected him. And you can check that out in Matthew 12, 22 to 37. Matthew 12, 22 to 37. However, at the same time here, we see the servant's faith in the second part of verse 4. He says, Yet surely the justice due to me is with Jehovah, and my recompense with my God. And the words yet surely show a sudden change of attitude here. Even though he seems to be discouraged, he's not really. He recognizes that he did accomplish the work which God had sent him to do. Moreover, having magnificent success was not necessarily part of his calling. The justice, he says, due to me is with Jehovah. In other words, God knows the situation and he is fully in control of the circumstances. We see second here, he says, my recompense is with my God. God will be the one who will repay accordingly. So in verses 1 to 4, while it seems to be a prayer of discouragement, it actually was not, because the verse ends with a high note of faith. And so at this point, we now see God's answer in verses 5 and 6. God answers the servant's prayer with words of encouragement here. Now, in the life of Messiah, God's message would come to the servant by means of an angel. And we see that in Luke 22:43. Luke 22:43. And here in verse 5, the servant's original commission is reiterated. Now says Jehovah that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him, and that Israel be gathered unto him. For I am honorable in the eyes of Jehovah, and my God is become my strength. So once again here, in reference to the mother without mentioning a father. From the womb, the servant was called by God. Now, there's a twofold task to the servant's original calling. First of all, it was to bring Jacob again to God. That's in verse 5. Now, this means to bring in the sense of conversion. One aspect of the servant's ministry was to bring salvation to Israel. A second aspect is to gather. Now, it's to gather for it's for Israel to be gathered to him as the messianic person. So the second part, or the second aspect of the servant's commission, is the physical restoration of Israel. Therefore, this servant of Jehovah, of Isaiah, had a twofold commission. First of all, he had to bring the salvation to the Jewish people, and second, the restoration of Israel. This was his original commission. In spite of his seeming failure in verses 1 to 4, in verse 5, the reason for his success is, he says it here, he says, for I am honorable in the eyes of Jehovah, and my God is become my strength. Now, given Israel's rejection of the servant, the question arises of how these objectives would be accomplished. Now, in addition to the original commission, verse 6 adds another commission. Yea, he said, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give you for a light to the Gentiles, that you may be my salvation unto the end of the earth. Now, the Father says to the Son, you've not failed, though it seems that nobody is following you. Although it seems that Israel will not be saved nor restored, quite the contrary. The day is coming when Israel will be saved. Israel is going to be restored to the land. Israel's rejection of Messiah at his first coming was all part of God's plan. It did not need to be a source of discouragement. It was always God's plan that for a period of time, the first two objectives described in verse 5 would be set aside in order that salvation may now go out to the Gentile world. So it wasn't a failure at all. He says here it's too simple a thing. He says to use you only to save Israel. God is saying to the servant, I'm going to use you in an even greater way. You will not only bring salvation to Jews, but you'll also bring salvation to Gentiles. For I will make you for a light to the Gentiles. Now, back in Isaiah 42:1, a couple of weeks ago, we saw that the Gentiles would somehow benefit from Messiah's coming. Now we're told exactly how this would be accomplished. This messianic statement in Isaiah 49:6 is the background to John in the Gospels, John 8:12, where Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He that follows me shall not walk in the darkness, but shall have the light of life. He didn't say I am the light of Israel. He says, I am the light of the world. That means Jews and Gentiles alike. Now, when Jesus gave the apostles the Great Commission in Acts 1:8, he mentioned Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and onto the uttermost parts of the earth. Therefore, the servant receives an additional commission. He says that you may be my salvation unto the end of the earth. This is an idiomatic phrase for the Gentile world. That's the end of the earth. Jews, Israel, rest of the world, Gentile. Now, this statement is also the background to Romans chapter 11. Why? Because Romans 11 is a detailed exposition and expansion of this one verse. That God has a plan for Israel, but Israel rejected her Messiah. And the rejection of Israel opened up the gates of salvation to the Gentiles. In Romans 11:1-10, Paul states that Israel nationally rejected her Messiah, even though individual Jews have accepted him. If you want to look at Romans 11, look at verses 11-12. I'll read them for you. Romans 11:11-12. I say then, this is Paul, I say then, did they stumble that they might fall? God forbid. But by their fall salvation is come unto the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if their fall is the riches of the world, and their loss the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? What Paul is doing here is expanding the theology of Isaiah 49:6, because in Isaiah 49:1-4, it seemed as if the servant of Jehovah was discouraged. It seemed that his original commission to restore Israel had failed to come to pass because of Israel's rejection. However, God's answer to the Messiah is this: no, not at all. The program has not failed. It's on track. Rather, this rejection is only temporary, because I intend to make you more than merely salvation to the Jews. You will also bring salvation to the Gentiles. Now, it is within the scope of the salvation of the Gentiles that ultimately Israel is going to be saved. Why? God is saving Gentiles today so that they can provoke the Jews to jealousy in such a way that many of them will come to Messiah. The Greek term translated as to provoke to jealousy is parazelu. Parazelu. It's a combination of two Greek terms, para and zelu. Para means to come alongside of. Zelu means to cause to burn, to seethe, to make red hot, to flame, to envy. So the picture here is that a Gentile believer is to come alongside a Jew, para, come alongside, in daily contact, and live such a life and be such a witness that the Jew will begin to burn with red hot envy, that's the Zelu word, for the very thing that the Gentile believer has, and that is his Jewish Messiah. God still has a remnant among the Jews today. We see that in Romans 11:1-10. And the remnant comes to saving faith by being provoked to jealousy by Gentile believers. That Israel is ultimately going to be saved is Paul's point in Romans 11, 25 to 26. Paul says this, Romans 11, 25 to 26. For I would not, brethren, have you ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own conceits, that a hardening in part has befallen Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, even as it is written. Now, notice how Romans 11 is a brilliant, beautiful expansion of what is happening in Isaiah 49. It is merely an expansion of the theology set forth. The Messiah comes for the purpose of restoring Israel. Israel rejects the Messiah. The servant might be discouraged, but God says, no, the rejection is just temporary. It is through Israel's rejection that salvation has gone out to the Gentiles. Yet, the mercy shown to the Gentiles was not to the total exclusion of the Jews, for even among the Jews, there is still a remnant coming to saving faith today. And we see that in Romans 11:5. Romans 11:5. Now, back to verses 5 to 6 of 49. Verses 5 to 6 contain God's answer to the Messiah's seeming complaint, although the complaint was made in all faith. Now in verse 7, which we're going to go on to, of Isaiah 49, we see both the rejection and the exaltation of the servant. Verse 7, Isaiah 49:7. Thus says Jehovah, the Redeemer of Israel, and his Holy One, to him whom man despises, to him whom the nation abhors, to a servant of rulers. Kings shall see and arise, princes, and they shall worship, because of Jehovah that is faithful, even the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you. The verse begins here, verse 7 begins by declaring that Jehovah is both the Redeemer and the Holy One of Israel. And for this reason, there must be both a salvation and a restoration of Israel. Then the verse shows the rejection of the Messianic person. You'll notice that in verse 7, we have a summary of the entire career of Christ in both his first and second coming aspect. First part of verse 7, we see the rejection of the Messianic person. First of all, he is despised by man, by humanity in general. Second, he is abhorred by the nation. Now, the nation, singular, is Israel. He is despised by the Gentiles and abhorred by Israel. Third, it says he's a servant of rulers. The creator of the universe, the God-man, would become the servant of the rulers of this world, meaning that during his lifetime, he would be in subjection to both Jewish and Gentile authorities and would render unto Caesar the things that were Caesar's. However, the time is coming, God says, when this despised, rejected Messianic king is going to be the one who is going to be in exaltation. Several points are made concerning his second coming. First, he says, kings, when they see him, shall arise in respect. Second, princes will worship him. This is the worship due to the servant, the God-man. Why will this come to pass? Well, first of all, Jehovah is faithful. It will come to pass. He will keep his promise to the servant. Second, Jehovah has chosen or elected this particular servant and will keep his promise to him. Therefore, verse 7 is an answer to the servant's complaint in verses 1 to 4. In verse 4, the servant has been rejected. Nevertheless, that rejection will someday give way to due exaltation. Now, a similar statement is made in Isaiah 52, verse 13, where it says, Behold, Isaiah 52:13, Behold, my servant shall deal wisely. He shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. And in verse 15, so shall he sprinkle, this is Isaiah 52, so shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him. For that which had not been told them shall they see, and that which they had not heard shall they understand. We're going to look at that passage in detail when we get to it, but it's very similar in the phrases used in it, because in Isaiah 49, we have the calling of the servant in chapter 50, the sufferings of the servant, and in chapter 52 and 53, the death of the servant of Jehovah. It's a continuous and logical progression. Boom, 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 all through. Now, you're going to see the restoration by the servant in verses 8 to 13, 49. Having shown that the servant's commission to save and restore Israel will eventually be accomplished, verses 8 to 3 then detail this restoration. The restoration will take place by means of the servant. In verse 8, thus saith Jehovah, in an acceptable time have I answered you, and in a day of salvation have I helped you. And I will preserve you and give you for a covenant of the people, to raise up the land, to make them inherit the desolate heritages. So concerning the servant of Jehovah, God says that in an acceptable time I will answer you. So when the time of Israel's restoration comes, then Messiah's prayer for Israel's restoration will be answered. Then he says, I'll make you a covenant of the people. So a time will come when the servant fulfills all the unfulfilled promises of the Jewish covenants, meaning the Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. Now, in a previous passage, Isaiah 42:6, Messianic person was to benefit two groups. Remember, the people and the Gentiles. Now, what this verse did not reveal is whether the two goals would be fulfilled simultaneously or chronologically. Now, verse 8 answers that question. At the first coming, the Messiah, the servant, was rejected by Israel, and as a result, he became the light to the Gentiles. Eventually, this program will be complete, and the fullness of the Gentiles will now have come in, Romans 11:25. And then at that point, God will work with national Israel so that all Israel will be saved, Romans 11:26. And then the servant will become the covenant of the people. Also, it says he will raise up the land. What does that mean? It means that he's going to restore the land to the people of Israel. And finally, he'll make them inherit the desolate heritages, meaning he'll restore the people of Israel to the land. So he's going to restore the land to the people of Israel, and then he's also going to restore the people of Israel to the land. Verses 9 to 11 is the removal of all obstacles to the return. Verse 9, saying to them that are bound, go forth, to them that are in darkness, show yourselves. They shall feed in the ways, and on all bare heights shall be their pasture. They shall not hunger nor thirst, neither shall the heat nor sun smite them. For he that has mercy in them will lead them, even by springs of water will he guide them. And I'll make all my mountains a way, and my highways shall be exalted. Notice 5 points concerning all obstacles being removed during the national return. First of all prisoners will be freed. Verse 9, first part of verse 9. All Jews in prison will be freed. Prison will not be an obstacle. Second, food will be provided for the returnees. Hunger will not be an obstacle. Second part of verse 9, first part of verse 10. Third, the returnees will be protected from the heat, and the sun will not be an obstacle. Verse 10. Fourth, water will be provided. Thirst will not be an obstacle. Verse 10. Fifth, highways will be provided, and mountains, valleys, crevices, and hills will not be obstacles when the final restoration of Israel comes by means of the servant. In verse 12, the regathering will be worldwide. Lo, these shall come from far, and lo, these from the north, from the west, and these from the land of Sinim. Now, the verse specifically mentions the north and the west, as well as the far, referring here to the south. Now, the exact location of Sinim is debated. In modern Hebrew, the name is a reference to China, but it may not be the same in classical Hebrew, however, or biblical Hebrew. However, there are also scholars who propose the China option, and Dr. Fruchtenbaum holds to the view that the term refers to a territory in the east. Now, in Isaiah's day, there were no Jews in China, but today there are Jews in China. And when the return comes, they will return from as far away as China, the land of Sinim. Verse 13 is now a hymn of praise over this final restoration. Sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth. and break forth into singing, O mountains, for Jehovah has comforted his people and will have compassion upon his afflicted. Now with this, first half of chapter 49 ends. Hopefully you've seen the basic drift that is later developed in the life of Messiah and in Romans 11. Servant's commission was to be the provider and restorer of Israel. However, he was rejected. He seems to be discouraged. Nevertheless, God says, no, no, no. Israel's rejection was my plan. And by means of Israel's rejection, salvation now goes to the Gentiles. When God has completed his program for the Gentiles, then the servant will succeed in bringing about the restoration of Israel from all over the world in verses 8 to 13. Now we come to the second part of the chapter. This is the consolation of Zion, 14 to 26. So now, at this point, we see the return of Israel from Zion's perspective. Verses 1 to 13, we see the return of Israel from Messiah's perspective. This is the return of Israel from Jerusalem's perspective, Zion, that is. 4 sections. First of all, we see Zion is not forsaken in verses 14 to 18. God says here that Zion is not forsaken. Verse 14 brings out Jerusalem's complaint. But Zion said, remember Zion is another term for Jerusalem. Zion said, Jehovah has forsaken me and the Lord has forgotten me. Because with the dispersion of the Jews from Jerusalem, the city is seen as being personified and viewed as being able to speak. Zion complains that Jehovah has forsaken her and the Lord has forgotten her. However, not so. The Lord responds in verse 15 in a very beautiful and moving way. He says, listen, can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? Yes, these may forget, yet will not I forget you. God is saying, I will never forget you. It's very seldom. It's very rare that mothers forget their children, although it does occur in rare occasions. Mothers rarely abandon their infant children. As rare as it is, though, from God's perspective, this could never, ever happen. It is impossible, because God could never forget Jerusalem. No matter how bad it may appear, he will never, ever abandon Jerusalem. Why can't God forget Jerusalem? Well, verse 16 gives the answer. Behold, I have graven you upon the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. The name of Zion is seen as being inscribed or tattooed upon God's hands. And because it is tattooed permanently on God's hands, for that reason alone, he cannot forget Jerusalem. Every time he lifts up his hands, he sees imprinted on his hands the name Zion, the name of Jerusalem. And secondly, the walls of Jerusalem are also continually before me. Now, what he means by that statement is explained elsewhere in Isaiah in chapter 62. The reason God cannot forget Zion, first of all, is because her name is inscribed in the palms of his hands. But there's a second reason why God cannot forget Zion, and that is because the walls of Jerusalem are continually before him. What does he mean by that? Well, go to Isaiah 62, verse 6 to 7. Isaiah 62, 6 to 7. Let me read it for you. I have set watchmen upon your walls, O Jerusalem. They shall never hold their peace day nor night. You that are Jehovah's remembrances, take ye no rest, and give him no rest till he establish and till he make Jerusalem a praise in the earth. Now, what is he saying here? Well, what he's saying here is this. Around the walls of Jerusalem to this day, there are angelic beings standing upon them. They only have one ministry as angelic beings. They sit upon the walls or stand upon the walls, and they are God's remembrances. Their ministry is to continually remind God that he has made a promise to Jerusalem. God, you've made a promise to make Jerusalem a praise in the earth, and now you must fulfill that promise. So that is the second reason why God cannot forget Zion. There are angelic beings on the walls of Jerusalem crying out to God all night and all day long, reminding him of his promises concerning Jerusalem. Now, let's go back to Isaiah 49:16. Your walls are continually before me. God has not forsaken Zion. In verses 16 to 18 is the overall proof of the fact. The proof that God has not forsaken Zion is threefold. First of all, God has inscribed her name upon his hands, verse 16. Second, in verse 17, your children make haste, your destroyers and they that made you waste shall go forth from you. The enemies of Zion will disappear while the sons of Zion will ultimately return. Third, ultimately, Zion will be clothed with the Jews returning from all over the world. Verse 18, lift up your eyes round about and behold, all these gather themselves together and come to pass. As I live, says Jehovah, you shall surely clothe you with them all as with an ornament, and gird yourself with them like a bride. So verse 12 shows that the returnees will come from all over the world. Now, Jehovah promised with a solemn oath that these returnees will be like an ornament for Jerusalem. The city will beautify herself with them like a bride makes herself beautiful on her wedding day. Now, in summary, the proof that God has not forgotten Zion, threefold. First, Zion's name is engraved on the palms of his hands. Second, the enemies of Zion will disappear while the sons of Zion will ultimately return. And third, Zion will be clothed with the returning Jews coming from all over the world. Also, verses 19 to 21, we're going to see the waste places shall be restored in those verses. Here we go. Verses 19 to 21. We're going to see the restoration of the areas in Israel that were destroyed and the places that were made waste. The population of Israel will be increased while the enemies will disappear. Verse 19 we are. For as your waste and your desolate places and your land that has been destroyed, surely now shall you be too strait for the inhabitants, and they that swallowed you up shall be far away. So here he's referring to the waste places in the land of Israel which will be restored and inhabited. Also in verse 20, the children of your bereavement shall yet say in your ears, the place is too strait for me. Give place to me that I may dwell. What he's saying here is that Zion will become too small to contain all the Jews who will return. While now Zion seems too large for the few Jews returning, Isaiah says that the time is coming when Zion will be too small for the returnees. When all the Jews return, we'll see Zion's response in verse 21. Then shall you say in your heart, who has begotten me these, seeing I have been bereaved of my children, and am solitary, an exile, and wandering to and fro? And who has brought up these? Behold, I was left alone. These, where were they? So Zion's response will be one of surprise and astonishment. Who has begotten me all these people? Where did these come from? Who has brought all these people up? I thought I was left alone. I thought I would have no more Jewish sons to dwell within my walls. But look, they've started to come back. Who has begotten me these? And the rest of the chapter now deals with the Gentiles, and verses 22 to 23 deal with the sheep Gentiles of Matthew 25 and the way that they are involved in the return of Israel. Sheep Gentiles are the righteous Gentiles. Here we go. I just did this quick recap before we get on to verses 22 and 23. Bit of a background to these verses before we get into them. Between the end of the tribulation and the start of the Messianic kingdom, there's a 75-day interval which you can find in Daniel 12, 11 to 12. Daniel 12, 11 to 12. Several things occur in this time, and one of them is a judgment of the Gentiles by King Messiah. According to Joel chapter 3, verses 1 to 3, this judgment takes place in the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is part of the Kidron Valley that separates the old city and the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives. So that's where the judgment's going to take place. All the Gentiles who survived the tribulation are gathered here for this judgment. We see that in Matthew 25, 31 to 32. The Messiah illustrated as a separation between the subjects of the judgment. We have the sheep on his right hand, the goats on his left hand. All of this is in Matthew 25. The judgment is now going to be based on the Gentiles' treatment of the Jews during the tribulation, revealing either pro-Semitism or anti-Semitism. Messiah will deal with the sheep and the goat Gentiles separately, beginning with the sheep in 34 to 40. Matthew 25, verse 34 states, Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So he invites them to enter the Messianic kingdom because they had fed him food and water, provided him with clothing and shelter, visited him when he was sick and in prison. The sheep Gentiles, whom Messiah called the righteous ones, the believers, will respond by saying, Oh, I don't remember seeing you in any of these conditions, nor do they remember doing any of these things for him. Messiah will answer, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it unto one of these my brethren, even these least, you did it unto me. That's Matthew 25:40. Now, this group, identified by Messiah as my brethren, has to be distinguished from the sheep and the goats. Sheep and the goats comprise all Gentiles, believers, unbelievers. Therefore, the brethren cannot be another category of Gentile believers, but these are actually Messiah's brethren according to the flesh. The Joel 3 passage clearly states that the judgment of the Gentiles is based on their treatment of the Jews in the tribulation. Messiah will say to these sheep Gentiles that whatever they did for the Jewish people during the tribulation will be reckoned as having been done unto him. And for that reason, they'll enter the Messianic kingdom. Then Messiah will turn to the goat Gentiles, declaring, Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire, which is prepared for the devil and his angels. These goat Gentiles, initially destined for hell, are ultimately destined for the lake of fire because they are cursed before Messiah, King Messiah. Messiah then explains the reasons why, identifying what the goat Gentiles failed to do for him. Goat Gentiles will also respond that we don't remember seeing you in any of these conditions. However, because they failed to do these things for him, the Messiah will say to them, Inasmuch as you did it not unto one of these least, you did it not unto me. Now, at this point, the goat Gentiles will be killed, and the sheep will enter the Messianic kingdom, where they'll populate the Gentile nations. This is the background to verses 22 to 26, Isaiah 49. Okay. Verses 22 to 23 focus on the sheep Gentiles. First of all, in verse 22, the righteous, these sheep Gentiles of Matthew 25, 31 to 46, will aid the return of the Jewish people to their homeland. The speaker of verse 22 is Jehovah. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, Behold, I will lift up my hand to the nations and set up my ensign to the peoples. And they shall bring your sons in their bosom, and your daughters shall be carried upon their shoulders. So, what we're seeing here is that righteous Gentiles will aid in the return of the Jewish people to Israel. They will be acting upon God's leading because it will be Jehovah who will lift up his hand for the nations nearby and set up an ensign for the peoples far away so that all nations will aid in this return. That's the first thing. Second, he says the Gentiles will protect the returnees in the first part of verse 23. The leaders of the Gentile nations will protect the returnees, and kings shall be your nursing fathers, and their queens your nursing mothers. The attitude of these kings and queens is further described in verse 23, the second part. They shall bow down to you with their faces to the earth and lick the dust off your feet. That's the second thing. Third, he says the Gentiles will be in subjection to Israel. The posture described here indicates the most profound reverence, head to the ground. And this willing subjection on behalf of the Gentile leadership will affirm to the Jewish people that Jehovah is their God. And here it says in the scriptures, And you shall know that I am Jehovah, and they that wait for me shall not be put to shame. Fourth thing we see in the last part of verse 23, Israel's response is that they shall know the Lord and will not be ashamed. 3 points are made about the sheep Gentiles. They'll aid in the return, they'll protect the Jews during the return, and they'll be in subjection to Israel when she's restored. And what about the goat Gentiles? The unrighteous Gentiles are the goats of Matthew 25. They're described in verses 24 to 26. They don't miss out. Not one iota. Now, several points. First of all, the Jewish captives among the goat Gentiles will be taken away from the enemy. This is in verses 24 and 25. Here we go. 24, 25. Shall the prey be taken from the mighty, or the lawful captives be delivered? But thus says Jehovah, even the captives of the mighty shall be taken away, and the prey of the terrible shall be delivered. For I will contend with him that contends with you, and I will save your children. Now, according to Zechariah 12, 1 to 3, Zechariah 12, 1 to 3, and Zechariah 14, 1 to 2, Zechariah 14, 1 to 2, when the goat Gentiles attack and take Jerusalem, this is in the tribulation period, notice that half the Jews will go into captivity. But now Isaiah says that these Jewish captives will be taken from these Gentile goat enemies, and second, the goat Gentiles themselves will be destroyed in verse 26. Here we go. I'll feed them that oppress you with their own flesh, and they shall be drunken with their own blood, as with sweet wine. And all flesh shall know that I, Jehovah, am your Savior and your Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob. So the third thing we see here is then, these Gentiles will recognize who Jehovah actually is in verse 26. Jehovah is Israel's Redeemer. Jehovah is Israel's Savior. Jehovah is the mighty one of Jacob. And that concerns the goat Gentiles. The goat Gentiles will lose their Jewish captives. They'll be destroyed, and then they'll recognize who God actually is. He is the Savior, the Redeemer, and the mighty one of the people of Jacob. And that is the message of chapter 49, which deals with the servant of Jehovah and his mission. His ultimate mission is to bring salvation to the Jews and Gentiles, and to bring about the ultimate salvation of the Jewish nation. And that is where we're going to leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.